I understand we can start. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming. And I am pleased to start our plenary session that we title Ethics, we titled with Margaret, Ethics, Forgetting and the Politics of Memory. For this panel, we invited 5 great scholars, and let me briefly explain you what was the reasons after inviting you. So the first is Alexander Etkind, who is the professor at the Department of International Relations and the Central European University but what is, I think, the most important, Alexander Etkind is the writer, is the author of many important books on the memories of Soviet repressions, mentioning Wramp Marnik, but I think, as you know, for me, the most important one is this Remembering Katyn and a few others. So I find you as a father of the memory studies of Soviet repressions. Wow. Together with Nancy Adler, who couldn't come, but she asked me to tell you that she crossed her fingers for us. She couldn't be with us, but she's with us with her heart. The second person that we invited is Andrea Gulotta. We know each other for years, and Andrea is at the moment professor at the University of Palermo, but he wrote an amazing book about intellectual life and literature on the Solovetsky Island, which for me was super important, and I recommend everybody. And he's also acting member of the Memorial Society. That's why I was very curious about having you with us. Next person is Luba Jurgenson, who is a professor of literature at the Sorbonne University. And she's also a representative of the Memorial Society France. For me, Luba is an amazing scholar. So she published several books, in my opinion, amazing books on the Gulag memories. The only problem is that they all are in French. So, and because of that, we don't have access to this huge and, in my opinion, so important work on memories of Soviet repressions done in France. So I wanted Luba to have with us that you can, see how important these researches are. Next is Enneken Lannes from the Tallinn University. And Enneken is a researcher of literature, and she had an important project on the memories in our part of in Central and Eastern Europe that stimulating, in my opinion, important discussions. And I really wanted you to have with us to continue the discussions that we started in Tallinn. And the last person that I would like to introduce you is Barbara Tonkis-Pleva, who is a professor in Lund University. At the moment, she's also president-elect of the Memory Studies Association, which is so important for us to, and I hope for having you with us. And Barbara is a researcher who stimulates a lot of discussions around the memories of in our Central and Eastern Europe, both of the Holocaust and on the Soviet repressions. And that's why I thought that having all of you here would be such important to get various perspectives on what we are discussing during this conference. So what is the formula for this meeting? The formula is that I wrote to all our panelists and said that I would like to have this plenary session that we, you have experience, and let's together discuss where we are in the field of memory studies of Soviet repressions. So how you see the past, how you understand the moment in which we are, and how what challenges are standing in front of us. And reaction was very positive, and here we are. So now I will give, I know that our speakers, they prepare like 12 minutes short interventions and not presentations, but interventions, yes, some voices. So I will give you now a chance to say to share with us your thoughts. And after we will open the discussion for everybody. As the first, I would like to ask you, Barbara, to say something about how you, as a scholar of memory in the Central and Eastern Europe, see where we are and how the situation changes.
This first day and the beginning of the second day were very inspiring for me. So I'm very happy to be here and thank you for the invitation. My short beginning reflection will be quite general, dealing in general not with any specific country, but as a region of Eastern and Central Europe. And I would like to focus on main challenges and tendencies that I see in politics of memory dealing with repressions or Soviet repressions, but also memories of the Nazi crimes, because I think one of most important challenges in dealing with the crimes of communism, I would say, we can discuss this concept, of course, it's their entanglement with the memory of Holocaust and Nazi crimes. And it is, of course, the result of historical events, that the fact that our societies in Eastern Central Europe have been exposed to both totalitarian regimes that replaced each other. And this led to a situation where the borders, the limits between perpetrators, victims, collaborators, bystanders were very unclear, since in this context of two totalitarian regimes, they often changed places. Moreover, what happened also during the Second World War and immediately after, there were also inter-ethnic clashes between different national and ethnic groups in Eastern Central Europe that made the whole history of these two regimes even more complicated. And this has been truly tragic experiences. Okay. Truly tragic experiences that have been simplified afterwards, especially during the communist times, when a simple opposition has been created between the victims of the innocent nations and Nazi or fascist, as it was called often, perpetrators. After the end of the Cold War, after the fall of communism in Eastern and Central Europe, there has been attempts to nuance this history, not only focus on victimhood, but also to speak about complicity, about collaboration. We have heard just in the morning session how different writers in Eastern Central Europe tried to deal with this issue, and even part of historians and other scholars did it as well. But these new narratives that nuance this history never gained popular support, huge popular support. Instead, the whole discussion about this has been politicized in different ways. So what we have seen is a tendency to what can be called externalization of guilt in relation to Nazi crimes and even in relation to repressions by Soviet or other communist regimes. So instead, there is a strong tendency on strong focus on victimhood, victimization, and even a victimhood competition, especially in relation to the Holocaust. And this has been expressed, for example, in Baltic states, in the phrases like double genocide, double occupation, and so on. And this has been contested and debated and so on. So the question is why these people in this region has so difficult to leave this position of seeing the nation just as innocent victim. And there are different reasons for this, of course. One that can be mentioned is that historically, in the 19th century, when these nations were in a way created as modern nation, when modern nation building was going on, they internalized image of their own nation as victims already at this time. And this identities has been also strengthened later on. So now to see their own group as a perpetrator is a source of ontological insecurity, since it is perceived as a threat to the group identity. And I think the concept of securitization of these memories is very important. And it has been proposed by Maria Melkso, and she was in her turn inspired by Copenhagen School of International Relations that emphasized the role of identity issues in politics and created this concept of ontological security. So the recognition of its own complicity raises the question of is problematic due to this ontological insecurity. But this is also connected to the fact that last decades globally, we have seen the rise of ideology of human rights. And as another researcher, Leah David, pointed out, this ideology which has erased the status of victims. So victimhood became a symbolic capital, a capital that can be transformed then to political, symbolic capital that can be transferred to political capital or even economic capital in regard to demanding reparation and so on. And this explains to some extent, at least, why especially center-rightist or especially politics on the right side of political spectrum are very critical to this self-critical memory, which involves recognition of own complicity. Because there is a fear that such acknowledgement of a complicity will lead to losing the moral capital and status as a victim, and then it leads it could lead to diminishing capacity to political agency for these countries on the political arena, including European Union, for example. So this is this matter of ontological security, which I think we need to have in mind when we discuss the memory of repressions and Holocaust. But also, I would add to this what we have seen especially after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. It's the rise of existential insecurity. And this also influences the politics of memory, because suddenly we realize that international political actors like Russia can use memories to justify, to legitimize aggression towards other countries. Which we have, of course, seen in relation to Ukraine, when the Nazi aspect is so emphasized by Russia. But we also see how Russia can exploit not unresolved historical tensions between different countries, nations in Central Europe, to try to influence bilateral relations or undermine solidarity between them. And I mean the discussion about massacres in Volhynia during the Second World War, where when they are warmed up in Poland very much, it's an example how also the external power can use the past and influence international relations. So this is again an example how difficult is to touch upon these issues because of the securitization. And last but not least, it's also the situation of war gives also the nationalist right in Central Europe new arguments to criticize the liberal ideas of self-critical memory, because what is argued now is that in the new situation, in the situation of existential insecurity, we need to raise new generation in loyalty and patriotism, and this means that we should promote the remembrance of their own nation's finest moments and sacrifices, instead of speaking about complicity and the wrongdoings that our nation should recognize. So it's a new situation in a way. So in general, I would just want to say that a huge challenge for dealing with the memories today is the political weaponization. Weaponization both on a national level, when different political parties used memory to undermine each other, and also on international level. I could give a lot of examples, but I think what we need today is to discuss this connection between geopolitics, shifts in international relations, and how they influence politics of memory and memory narratives. And just to conclude, because I don't have the time, I think an interesting example is how the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza influenced these narratives. In terms of the war of Ukraine, and if we go to European Parliament and discussion about crimes of communism in European Parliament on the level of EU. So we have seen that since 2009 there have been debates how much EU politics of memory should include the memory of Soviet repression, or what was called communist crimes of communism. And there were different stages in this. After the enlargement of the EU to the east, Eastern European political actors, especially on center-right, worked intensively, lobbied to make a European Parliament to recognize the crimes of communism as worth or remembering on the same level as the crimes of communism. And there has been a lot of controversy controversies around this, among others, on the part of political left in EU Parliament, who was very much resisted the idea that to compare crimes of communism with crimes of the Nazism and to have recognized them in the same way. And it was, of course, as well connected to their internal political issues on each countries were left and right fight for influence, for getting popularity. But what happened is that generally there were two resolutions in European Parliament that condemned the crimes of two totalitarianisms. So the word communism was never mentioned to begin with. And first, 2024, after the invasion on Ukraine, the third resolution of EU Parliament uses explicitly the phrase that crimes of communist totalitarianism. So this is really a huge change, and the same resolution says explicitly that we need to bridge the gap between existing regional and ideological divisions in historical awareness among European countries and people, with a view in building a common ground for dialogue as well as mutual understanding and respect. So suddenly there is a change in relation to this. And the war on Gaza is my last sentence. It's also interesting because we see here is a situation when Israel, due to the situation in Gaza, has lost a lot of its moral capital that built on the victimhood during the Second World War. And now suddenly the room has opened to discuss that maybe Holocaust should be treated as singular but not unique. And suddenly what was impossible before, to make straightforward comparisons between Holocaust and other genocides, now it becomes quite very much tolerable. So we see new development as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for your intervention. I think you raised so many questions and so many problems, and gave us this broad picture. And you stress particularly this changes in geopolitical changes. And I'm wondering, Enneken, how do you perceive these processes?
Yes, actually, my comments will also be about the larger political frameworks, but I might be more provocative than Barbara, so I hope you appreciate the provocation. And of course, the larger political frameworks, as Barbara already mentioned, are Russian aggression war in Ukraine and Israel's genocidal war in Gaza. Russian aggression war obviously has brought with itself the widespread appropriation of the memory of World War II in this war in the form of a rhetoric of denazification. And this, I think, forces us to question the role of a lack of serious reckoning with Soviet repressions in post-Soviet Russia, or what Alexander has called warped mourning. So the role of this, particularly in the popular support to this war, to the Russian war in Ukraine. And yesterday we discussed actually how Gulag is presented in Russia and some other former Soviet republics as part of the war effort during the World War II, where then this state violence is co-opted into the heroic narrative, national narrative of Russia. And I'm afraid I cannot agree here with Andrea in terms of war mourning being over in Russia in terms of the literary treatments. I think except for Lebedev, most of the authors you mentioned really domesticate the Gulag memory into Russian state narrative. For example, Yahina's Zuleika book, hailed as a great work of feminist memory and memory of ethnic and religious minorities. Actually, its narrative of Gulag is very Putinist, actually, Gulag building up this great country. So I think the war has highlighted the relevance of a study of Soviet repressions with all possible means in our hands in a situation where this has not been done at large scale in Russia. And this brings me obviously to the question of what can be done outside Russia in former Soviet and socialist republics that have had their own experiences of crimes and repressions. Alexander actually in the morning panel offered a positive interpretation of mobilization of weaponizations. I don't know what Susanna and Margaret had in mind, and they titled the conference in this way, but to a certain extent, it also, for me, this question of weaponization is still from the pre-war era in a certain sense, because it's true that the memory of Soviet and socialist crimes has been mobilized and is also weaponized in the context of war in many parts of Central and Eastern Europe that support Ukraine. But my question is, haven't we as left-leaning scholars of memory from the region spent too much time in the past 2 or 3 decades in criticizing victimhood narratives or victimhood nationalism in our countries? And Barbara mentioned the leading theoretical framework to analyze the issues of memory in the region, the securitization of memory or mnemonic security, and reviewing these frameworks retrospectively, I would even say that it's striking how symmetrically we have treated the memory politics in Putin's Russia and also in Central and Eastern European countries. So Polish memory politics has been seen as militant as the one in Putin's Russia. The Baltic one is interlocking cares with Russian one and so on, really symmetrical without seeing differences. But the war has shown us that some countries have acted out their politics of memory with violence, while the others have not. And it doesn't mean that they might not do so in the future. But I think we need a stronger critique of violence in our research. So while populist right and far right memory politics in Central and Eastern Europe remains a problem, I think a big problem, and we need to continue criticizing it. We also need to try to highlight these actors and areas and media of memory in our societies where serious study and reckoning of Soviet repressions and not only their weaponization is possible and is done. And for me personally, Michael Rothberg's concept of implication has been useful here. And in my current book project, I really try to look at those actors and projects in Central Eastern Europe that approach the question of Soviet repression from the perspective of this implication of the locals in the regime. I think these actors and projects are available. So the question, how they advance the study of and memory of Soviet repression, not as an external violence, but as a violence in which we contemporary generations are diachronically implicated because the previous generations collaborated in that violence or were indirectly implicated in it. So this is my first point. The second one is also what Barbara already mentioned, the Israel's war in Gaza, which I think will have a very strong impact on the study of collective memory in Europe, including the memory of Soviet repressions, the global memory culture centered on decades on the Holocaust is inevitably going to change, and the leading scholars in the field of Holocaust studies, genocide studies, and memory studies have started to reflect on our failure to prevent new mass atrocities in the societies that actually in the past 35 years have been actively commemorating past atrocities, both on the cultural as well as on the political level. So they are posing really uncomfortable questions about how the general frames of reference that have been developed by us, the scholars of history and memory, might have contributed to this failure. Particularly the cosmopolitan Holocaust memory, in the framework of which the Holocaust is conceptualized as both unique and universal. So, and how this has been have become liable for appropriation in the justification of new violence. And here I'm referred to, I think, a very important article by Aleida Assmann in a recent article in Journal of Genocide Research, where she maps the development of European politics of memory of a Holocaust, focusing on the Stockholm Declaration from 2000 and also the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance that has worked in the past to resist the inclusion of any other pasts into European memory, so Soviet repressions, but also that of European colonialism. And the line of research I personally follow closely is also Michael Rothberg's current work on historical comparisons and comparability of historical violence. And we know his 2009 book on multidirectional memory was already about that, but now his new book project is really trying to rethink the whole issue in the light of war in Gaza. And obviously, the question of comparability of histories of violence has been hugely important in Central and Eastern Europe already for decades. And on the one hand, as Barbara mentioned, there have been these problematic ways of comparing and equating Holocaust and Soviet repressions that have loomed large on the political level. But on the other hand, I think in academic research on the warped Holocaust memory in these countries has often been very dismissive towards Soviet repressions, to the extent that sometimes you have a feeling that they shouldn't be commemorated at all, because they are mostly seen as in a context of a use of a Holocaust template for a different history. And I could mention several important and award-winning studies that have this problem. So what is then ignored is precisely this entanglement of Holocaust and Soviet repressions, and perhaps the current moment of shifting global memory regimes could finally offer this opportunity to seriously study the legacies of this entanglement of the two regimes in the region. 1 minute left, but I still want to make my last point about how we look at the Central and Eastern Europe as a region, because after running a big comparative project on the memory cultures of a large number of Central and Eastern European countries, I have actually noticed how sometimes how little we pay attention to differences between these countries. So I have become less and less tolerant of how the research on Central and Eastern Europe in this research, often a huge number of different countries is lumped together under the banner of illiberalism or militant memory politics without necessary attention, at least for me as a scholar of culture and memory, to a more complicated picture of memory debates and conflicts in individual countries beyond the official memory of official politics of memory. And I think it's not only a problem of North American or Western European scholars who often come in and be generalized based on their bird eye perspective, but I think the scholars in the region too, we tend to assume that the memory cultures in other parts of Eastern Europe function in the same way as they do in the countries we study or in the countries where we are based. And I think this also concerns the weaponization of Soviet repressions now in the context of Russian war in Ukraine. So thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you particularly for putting these three important problems, how we understand the region, how the war in Gaza and Ukraine impact on our perception of and will impact the formation and of the memories of Soviet repressions, and on paying attention to this politicization of memory in Russia. So Bara said about EU level, you said about problem in Russia, but there is also a problem of, or maybe not, of activists, how these memories were so far developed in our field. And maybe you, Andrea, could say something more about it.
Sorry. Good. Well, thank you. And I will like to continue that discussion with you because I have a different point of view on that. But let's focus on this now. Maybe over the coffee break we can have a discussion. Right. Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me. And when speaking about memory is always walking on slippery ground. As we know, there's some things that happen, and we understand that many years afterwards, and everything is changing right now, and it's important to have moments of exchange like this one today. And what Zuzana asked me to bring to the floor is my point of view is memorial, because as she said, I have 1 foot in, 1 foot out, 1 foot out being as a researcher that works on Soviet repression, on memory, culture, and literature, Soviet repression, and 1 foot in because I'm actively involved in memorial. So it's difficult to say where we are, but there are a few things that we can try to put on the table, and that's what I would try to do. Well, first of all, the forced shutdown of Memorial in 2021, I tend not to use liquidatia and liquidation, which are Soviet terms. And the forced shutdown was part of a larger plan that if we see speeches, politics and laws made by the Russian state come back many years behind. Barbara was speaking about the far right exploiting the insecurity. Well, the meeting of Putin with historians in November 2003 was exactly about this, about how history books needed to give a more persuasive and patriotic image of the past. And we've seen how this has played under in different ways. And the last phase of this, the last stage of this long fight between state power and independent actors, not only Memorial, mainly Memorial, but not only, obviously, to have a monopoly on the narration and on the space of memory could probably be considered the shutdown of Memorial. Also because it happened just before the start of the large-scale invasion. This occupation of the space of memory happened in different ways along the years and with different tactics. One of them was the removal, for example, Pierre 36, the local management by Memorial was removed and was put in a new management, which, as Anakin mentioned, linking to something that Anakin mentioned, the first exhibition he made was the contribution of Gulag prisoners to the victory in the Great Patriotic War. The second event, the second type of approach was the moving away from the center, not removing completely, but moving away from the center. And I'm specifically referring to Moscow, what happened in the urban space of Moscow, where there was a museum of the history of the Gulag in the center. There was the Solovki stone in the center, and the state invested a lot, made a considerable effort in creating mockery, similar places, but outside of the center. So the Stena Skorbi, the Wall of Sorrow, was put under Sadova, the new Museum of the History of the Gulag. I huge enterprise, which also, by the way, saw the active role of Memorial and other NGOs, was opened but outside of the center. And so there was a way of somehow taking away from the center stage this topic. And then there were direct attacks, and the most impressive case is Sandarmoch, what happened with the arrest of Dmitriev, the rewriting of the history of Sandarmoch with this theory completely unsubstantiated by two historians about the fact that in Sandarmoch there were victims, Soviet Red Army soldiers, victims of the fence instead of victims of Stalinism, which led to, as you know, probably excavations of the burial ground in search of these bodies. So it was an occupation of the space of memory, which was both conceptual and also physical. And the conceptual can be seen quite clearly from the speeches and what is written in the laws and the politics put forward by the government. This is a replica of a typical post dynamic which has happened in the field, a top-down dynamic where the state says what has to be done, and a bottom-up dynamic from instead. It's difficult to call it civil society, but let's say not only activists, but also individual citizens. I mean, if you look back of the terror, the victim had to be eliminated, but still, even though the photographs were maybe cancelled or burned, there were families kept the traces of the victim. And this is how, for example, the archive of Memorial has remained active. Plus, in recent times, this has created, for example, everybody says that the creation of Memorial was a product of perestroika, which is absolutely true, but the party very fiercely opposed the creation of Memorial as a registered NGO and as a registered association. And if you look into the folds of this history, you actually see a type of opposition in that. So what's happening now is quite similar. Memorial has been liquidated in Russia. It's publicly forbidden to do a few things, but people still read the names. I know some of you have read the names yesterday in Poland, here in Warsaw. Names were read in many cities in Russia, including on the Solovki stone in front of the Lubyanka, of the NKVD grounds, which is something that the state has publicly forbidden since 2020 for COVID regulations. Still, there are people who leave flowers on Ukrainian monuments when there are tragic events related to the war in Ukraine, or they do it on monuments of Soviet repression related to the victims of Soviet repression when, for example, like it happened with the funeral of Navalny. So there is somehow an overlapping between these memories, but there's also somehow an activism that's being carried out in Russia in the current condition, which of course are not easy for anyone. It is anyway a different era, and now I will try to focus on Memorial in particular. Memorial has been not entirely annihilated in Russia. It still exists in local branches. What has been closed is the International Memorial, which was the main branch in Moscow, and the Human Rights Center. However, it still goes on. There are activities that are being kept on in very difficult conditions. But what's happened is that many activists have been forced to leave. Some activists, as you know, are in jail right now. And in general, there has been an internationalization of Memorial. Many new branches of Memorial were created. Up until 2020, the only two foreign branches of Memorial were the German and the Italian. Now we have 17 different associations that have formed themselves as the new International Memorial, which is now registered in Switzerland. And it's interesting what's happening also in the field of memory. This memory is also being globalized. So, for example, reading the names before was something that happened only in Russia. Last year was done in 45 different countries and 141 cities. I don't know how many this year because it happened yesterday, but the numbers will likely be the same. Some of the projects of Memorial have been transferred abroad. So, for example, the school competition that used to happen in Moscow, which was one of the main projects now, is being done in Germany. And there are continuous new way of talking about this memory. For example, in September, we've organized a summer school with Memorial in Palermo, where we've analyzed practices of remembering victims of mafia and victims of the Gulag. And this is creating interesting processes, I would say, of reshaping, re-sematization and development of new memory dynamics. And there's also, I have to say, there is a close connection with other memories that relate to other events, and overall a fairly open post-colonial approach. But of course, there's also substantial challenges, which I have to say have a direct impact on research, if we're talking about this. Well, first of all, organizational. Most of these new memorials live in extreme difficult condition, made by people who have just moved to a new country. And it's difficult because there's different associations that have different needs and different backgrounds. It's quite difficult. Before, it was quite easy. Let me say this, in a colonial environment where Moscow was the center and everybody had to follow. It was rather easy to work in that. Now this is being questioned and it's creating problems. There's challenges in the global space. The fact that Memorial is mainly outside of Russia now questions the very nature of Memorial. Quite often people say that Memorial was needed in Russia and now outside is not that needed. And this is creating big questions around the very nature of the work of Memorial in this context. There's challenges in funding. Most of the Memorial branches don't have funding and struggle a lot to survive and to put forward their activities. Most of the actions, like yesterday, the returning the names, which is a huge action that involves a huge effort of many people to organize it, is mainly done on crowdfunding, which is something that, of course, creates huge problems. But of course, when we speak specifically about research, there's challenges in preserving the past, the archives, and also the present. There's repression going on. There are documentations that are being accrued. It's difficult to understand how to archive these, all this material. And there's changes in some sort of overlapping between the memory of past repression and memory of current repressions, and also in the nature of Memorial, in the sense that Memorial for many, many years has had quite a balanced way of working on memory and human rights. Now, of course, the focus is mainly on human rights because of the current crisis, and this is creating some problems as well. But it's also a new era in state power right now. We haven't seen big arrests in a very long time, and we know that some activists live in Russia right now. We haven't seen arrests on people who read the names. They're left there to read. We have seen in 2023 the Stalin bust in Miedna. We haven't seen these sort of actions anymore, these sort of huge actions anymore. There was the initiative to rename Stalingrad. We were all thinking that Volgograd was going to be back to being Stalingrad, and it froze. The Museum of the History of the Gulag has been shut down. And we all thought that was the end of it. Instead, now we heard that there's a new director coming in and they're opening it soon. And especially Sandarmokh. The theory about Sandarmokh, the Soviet army, the Red Army, has led to nothing. They haven't found the bodies. The silence, complete silence about it. The state hasn't pursued in that direction. So in conclusion, where are we now? Difficult to say. There's a lot of challenges. It's difficult to understand what is happening also from the point of view of the state. Are they preparing a new offensive to further promote their memory agenda? Or are they believing that the war is finished, the war on memory, I mean, and so that's the end of it. They don't need to insist anymore. It's interesting to understand what happens next. Of course, it will depend on a variety of issues, but if there will be another moment, another emotional moment, like the one that led to the creation of Memorial, it will be interesting to see on which ground it will happen in Russia, in a context where institutions have monopolized everything, and what will happen abroad. And I think I will leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And Luba, would you like to add something about Memorial, and particularly what Andrea said about these changing landscapes of the Soviet repressions and Gulag? It is what you deal with for years.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you very much for inviting me. And I agree completely with what Andrea said about memorial in France, because I also represent the French branch of memorial, and we encounter the same kind of interrogations. And I was particularly interested by this question, of course, of the space of about this killing site, Sandarmor, you spoke about. It was also a place I investigated when I could still to go to Russia. And so I will speak especially about this topic of landscape, maybe which was already mentioned here, but maybe remains still a little bit marginal in memory studies, and it seems to me to be a very important topic through which we can study the Soviet repressions and repressions in general. And so in 2010 was France-Russia year in France. And to mark the occasion, an exhibition entitled Solovki Island, Wonders of Northern Russia, was organized under the patronage of UNESCO and with the blessing of Patriarch Kirill of Moscow. And the photographs on display presented a series of magnificent landscapes. It was a perfect example of how landscape can be used to erase the memory of the camps. For nothing in this exhibition reminded visitors that these beautiful landscapes were also home to the first large Soviet camp. And we know that even, especially Andrea, even at the time of the Solovki camps, this landscape was being exploited. For example, in Cherkasov's propaganda film made in 1928, or in Gorky's article, which dwells on the beauty of the place. But what initially motivated my interest in the landscape of places of violence some 20 years ago was not so much their exploitation as the seductive power that this beauty can exert even on a discerning eye, and the ethical problems that this poses. It was my start point. This research, therefore, began with the ethical question linked to the aesthetic perception of landscapes. When I refused to participate in the presentation of the exhibition, I was asked, but why? There were camps, okay, but that does not negate the beauty of the landscape. It's a real question, which seems very naive, but the very naivety reveals an aporia that I hope will prove fruitful. Does the concentration camp past negate this beauty or not? When I went to Kolyma in 2004, I exclaimed when I saw the mountains, how beautiful. And inner sensor immediately responded, how can you find this beautiful when it's a mass grave? This inner dialogue was the beginning of a new field of research. I felt as if my eyes were trapped. What I call beauty is the product of my education, of European visual history, of my exposure to works of art and literature and so on. And this history of the gaze, which must be taken into account when considering the relationship with the landscape, intersects with other stories that of the Soviet industrial project aimed at exploiting the resources of these mountains using slave labor. That of the prisoners themselves, for whom these boundless expanse become a vast open air prison. And we know from the testimonies of survivors and certain images drawn by inmates, and that of the actors of memory who, like Ivan Panikarov mentioned it yesterday, roam these landscapes in search of vestiges of the past and the story of the indigenous populations to one colonization according to some, or development or industrialization according to others, brought both civilization, hating permanent houses, hospitals, but also the destruction of their natural environment, russification and uprooting. Finally, there is this history of the non-human actors in these places: trees, stones, animals, water. Mountains have been dynamited, water has been diverted to serve the mines, forests have been cut down, animals have been slaughtered. All of this is part of the biographies of these landscapes. By landscape, I mean the complex interaction between living beings in an ever-changing present, but also over a long period of time. It is not only a representation, but also a set of practices and experiences. And that the landscape from time immemorial has had a political dimension. The landscape perspective is, of course, influenced by my belonging to a certain culture, which I accept, and I am well aware that what constitutes landscape for me does not necessarily constitute landscape for others. But I believe that this cultural difference of the gaze is always fruitful. This is why I am attached to the local dimension of landscape study. My research is definitively local of landscape studies, and interested in the perception stories and knowledge of the inhabitants or people who frequent these places. In this sense, my approach is similar to yours, Susanna, and the concept of milieu, of memory, is very useful when working on the traces of violence in the landscape. In particular, it allows us to avoid the term environment, which I find inappropriate, even though it is used everywhere, also by me sometimes, when talking about nature, because the environment is what is around us. Whereas I'm part of, the researcher is part of the landscape. I'm inside it, in the middle of it. I have some. When working on landscape, I'm interested in places of memory, but also in the non-places of memory. That is, in places where there is no visible trace of the mass violence that happened there, and in what these places can tell us despite everything. A trace is something that only exists when someone questions it, when there is an interpreter. In a sense, I'm the one who creates the trace. It is thus a question of approaching nature in these places with the suspicion, or rather to develop an archaeological conscience, to train the glance to see beyond and under what offers itself to him, to us initially. A massacre site is like a landscape hidden beneath the landscape. So all kind of violence, battles, genocides, organized famines, massacres, displacement of population, forced labor, ghettos, concentration, and extermination camps took place in fields, villages, forests, ravines, mountains, rivers, and so on. And these crime scenes rapidly transformed by nature are thus both living archives of the past and reservoirs of present memorial content. So I start from the hypothesis that landscapes are an essential vector of collective memory. Indeed, a relationship to landscapes is a vital factor in the construction of group and individual identities. However, however, the transmission of memory of mass violence has not yet been considered another in research theme regarding landscape. And to conclude, I want to say that the notion of landscape includes a dynamic dimension which focuses of the final destination, absent from that of place, which focuses on the final destination, and not on the paths towards it. It sheds light. The notion of landscape sheds light on displacements, whether they be transports to sorry. Yes. So we can say that the landscape, but its shifting and protean character obliged to privilege not linear forms of knowledge construction, including the disparate, the unexpected, the unstable, the ambivalent, and to approach mass violence through the landscape is to open up to a resolutely dynamic conception of the scientific field, and consequently to a new way of looking at the process of knowledge itself. Thank you. And sorry for...
Thank you very much, and thank you for raising this problem of non-human and of landscape and how it remember and also stimulate our memories. And now I would like to ask Alexander. Maybe you can somehow, as a researcher who for years researched the memories of Soviet repressions, can say something, or you want to show us something, you know, to go forward, yeah, and to show us something here. The floor is for you.
Well, thank you. Does it work? Yeah, there is a lot of technology that I am going to use. I hope it will all work. We'll see. All right. But basically, yeah, so my starting point is actually what Andreas said just a few, probably an hour ago, that that warped morning is over. That's the title of my book that I published in 2013. And that was entirely different era, but still we have memory studies, still we have Eastern Europe, we have a war, and my intuition is that it's entirely different field nowadays, but I cannot really tell you what is it now. So this is what exactly what I want to show you. as a part of my own research. And I actually prepared this particular research for this conference. So that's the first time that I'm talking about that. And that's a story of the Soviet past. So basically, on the one hand, the story, the plot line is very kind of well known, that in order to understand the present, we're kind of digging back in the past just to find out some kind of remarkable figures who were doing the same, who were also digging even in the more remote past. And the story that I'm going to tell you, it's like still warped, but somehow it's less subtle. I think that the analysis that we all liked to do earlier, because one of the consequences, I think, of this military condition is that everything has been radicalized and intensified, and therefore, say, I feel that I'm interested in more kind of intensive ways of articulating cultural memory. So I will be talking about one particular, yeah, please help me, one particular piece by Dmitry Shostakovich, the Soviet composer. And so it was first performed in 1967, a part of his 14th symphony. Let's listen. It should just work, that it should just, yeah, click. Yeah. And click again. No. No, it should be. No. Okay. We tried, it worked. Yeah. Okay. So here is the text. Yeah, let's stop the music. So this is a kind of all right, back. No, back. So yeah, we need this slide, but we don't need more. We cannot shut it.
Just mute the computer. Yes.
Oh,
No. Just put, yeah. Yeah. Let's do that. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, thanks. So here is the text. It's also kind of a piece of transnational memory because it's kind of French, Russian, Ukrainian story with some kind of Polish touch. So here is the text. This is what the people were singing in that piece. Мой Вилен Барабас, ты преступнее Варабы в 100 раз, в самых мерзких грехах ты погряз, нечистотами вскормленный с детства, nourished with filth and mud. So if you, of course, we don't have time for reading this in details, but this is the strongest challenge to social power that have been kind of translated into words, into poetry. So what kind of poetry is this? Basically, this is an apocryphal text allegedly written by the Cossacks of Zaporozhye to the Turkish Sultan, in which these Cossacks, Ukrainian Cossacks, refused to pay yoke or tax to the Sultan. And they allegedly they produced this text in the 17th century. It was actually a forged document, probably forged in the early 19th century. And it produced lots of cultural responses in different arts, in visual art, we will see it very soon, and in poetry and in music. So Shostakovich, for this particular piece, used the poetry of the French poet Guillaume Apollinaire, translated by the Soviet poet and translator Mikhail Kudzinov. Guillaume Apollinaire, who was actually a Polish of Polish origin, his mother owned an estate in the contemporary Belarus as a Polish gentlewoman. And he was quite a character, Apollinaire, founder of surrealism and much else. Used this, probably he found this document in some kind of French textbook of Russian history. And he used this text in his early love lyrics, La chanson du mal aimé, in which it's basically out of context. He was a surrealist author. But basically, he identifies with the Sultan. He doesn't identify himself with the victims or with the Cossacks. He identifies himself with the Sultan and produces several associations from the Bible and from this Ukrainian history in order to show the strength of the power of his love or something like that, and the force of rejection to his love claims. Shostakovich, of course, could use any kind of this actual historical document or some other rendering of it, but he preferred to use the translation by the Gulag survivor, Mikhail Pavlovich Kudzinov, who was incarcerated in 1948. He got 10 years for the group anti-Soviet propaganda. And he served in the famous then camp in northern Kazakhstan, the Jeskazgan camp. Yeah, and he took part, or allegedly even organized, a rebellion in Jeskazgan, which was a response to the even much more famous Kengir rebellion, which was one of the most kind of remarkable pages in the history of the Gulag. He got another term in the second trial. He was released, but very soon. So the rebellion was took part in 1954. He survived it all, and he became, like some other kind of survivors, he became a translator and an author of children books. So in the bottom you see the covers of his children books. Let's go further on if we could. Yeah, but okay. Here is some words from Shostakovich. And he said, it's stupid to protest against death as such, but you can and must protest against violent death. These thoughts also found reflection in the 14th Symphony. That's why I chose Apollinaires, the Zaporozhian Cossack's answer to the Turkish Sultan for the 14th Symphony. Everyone immediately thinks of Repin's famous painting and smiles happily. But my music bears little resemblance to Repin's painting. If I had Apollinaire's talent, I would address Stalin with a poem like that. I did it with music. This is that Repin's painting, in which those very Cossacks write that very letter, refusing to pay the tax. And now this is a photo produced by a French photographer on the front lines of the current war. So he asked the Ukrainian soldiers to using their uniforms and weapons just to take the same positions and kind of parody, but also reenact that very performance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was amazing. Like the whole panel, I want to say, the European politics, the current political situation, memorial landscape, music, and the return of like some, that's the question, how much it is traveling, how much it is simply appearance of something from the past. Thank you very much for these amazing presentations. And now we have half an hour for your questions. I do believe there is many questions, so please raise your hands.
Thank you. My name is Damian Zich. First of all, thank you for your speeches, especially bringing attention to such diverse yet complex topics. But I would like to have a question to Barbara about the ontological insecurity in the Central European region. I would like to ask you about your perception of the sources of this insecurity. The reasoning behind it also points to the European context. Central Eastern European countries, by entering to the European Union, were expected to embrace the Holocaust memory that led to the ontological insecurity, perception of a threat, and this modern backlash in the form of the victimhood nationalism. But I would like to ask you about the role of Russia in it, as victimhood status also requires the recognition of it by others, especially by perpetrators. In today Russia's official memory, this lack of recognition, denial of responsibility, only prompts Central Eastern European states to embrace its victimhood memory focus on it at the expense of the Holocaust memory. What is your opinion on it? Thank you.
I have a question for Andrea. Thank you so much for your insights as a scholar and also as an activist. I'm focusing in my own research on the Last Artist project in Russia and the activist voices, the Last Artist project and the activist voices, they are still active there. And I think it's a very important project and also phenomena when studying the contemporary culture of remembrance in Russia. And this is why I wondered somehow that you didn't mention it. And it leads me to a very obvious and also simple question. Why is this project still active, even though Memorial was liquidated? So yeah, if we use this word. And also here comes a follow-up question. Could it be that the language Memorial brought up in the late 80s, the language of remembrance, and somehow the Last Artist project adopted it in 2014. Could it be that it isn't really a counter memory to the state narrative? So, yeah.
Hey, Tyler Kirk, University of Alaska Fairbanks. Thanks everybody for really just fantastic presentations. And I have a question for Luba, because I'm also really interested in landscapes. We were talking about the other day, and artwork. And so I was curious about, translating images that Gulag prisoners created, and also dealing with, some of the images, and I'll show some of them when I present, do contain like this kind of sense of wonder, like depictions of nature as like the absence of the state. So could you just talk a little bit more about, the traces of violence that you've tracked through these landscapes and the ways in which you've dealt with that in your own work?
Okay, thank you. And now I would like to ask you to answer the questions, if you can.
Okay, thank you for the question. Of course, I focused mostly in my talk about victimhood narratives in East Central Europe, and not touched a lot about Russia, but I would say that a lot can be said about this. First and foremost, I would like to say that we can see two aspects. When I, for example, listen to how memory of the Soviet repression in the Soviet Union is remembered, I sometimes think that it's still very much about focusing on the Russian people in Gulag. And there is a kind of tendency to also in Russian literature on Gulag to focus on the suffering of the innocent victims. I think we are lacking still exactly the discussion about complicity in this system of common people who also were victims, but they could also be perpetrators. This is, and also about more about focus about other national groups who suffered in Gulag. So my point is here that in Russia we see the same, this focus on the own victimhood in relation to the Soviet crimes of the Soviet time. But on the other hand, nowadays during the ongoing war, we also see focus on victimhood in terms presenting Russian people as being again attacked by the West. So this is this narratives which is very much emphasized now, and it's also interesting again in relation to because I'm very much interested in European politics and European memory. So it's also very interesting to see this change that Russia, until the invasion on Ukraine in 2022, could use a kind of moral capital towards the West, emphasizing the own participation in the victory over Nazis. And now there are indications that this moral capital has diminished in the context of the new situation. So the victimhood that could be mobilized around Second World War and Russian suffering in fighting the Nazis can be now at least problematized.
Turn, I imagine. Well, first of all, thank you very much. It will be very interesting to hear more about your research. You asked me 3 questions. One is very easy to answer. Another one a bit more complex. The last one is a notion, but I would try. Why I didn't mention it? Time. We were given only 12 minutes. I had a lot of things to talk about. But obviously, when I spoke about the bottom-up approach, I was thinking exactly of projects like, it's difficult to call a project. I mean, Последний адрес is more than a project, but they're reactions to the top-down approach, right? The archives are closed, the names have been hidden, there's no access, so we bring them up. We bring them up from the bottom. We put them out. We put them on streets. We put them on the walls. So it is still being carried out in a very difficult and conflictual situation, because the elephant in the room that I haven't mentioned for reasons of time in my speech is the wide consensus also on this topic of the memory of repression that Putin has. And this wide consensus has translated itself also in violent acts against activists, but also against projects that form the landscape, the urban landscape of memory. So many of the items of the Последний адрес have been damaged, but every time they have been restored, overnight or rewritten or recreated. This happened also with monuments of, for example, the monuments to the executed victims or Polish executed victims in Lewaszowo was destroyed 3 times and 3 times remade by activists and put exactly in the same way. So it is a type of fight that keeps on being fought right now, and it is something that certainly deserves attention. So it is one of the battleground, if we can use a military vocabulary right now in terms of war. I don't know if this is ethically questionable, but if we use it, it is definitely a battleground. The Последний адрес and this sort of fight between different forces that try to eliminate these traces, to follow somehow, to adhere to the national governmental view of the memory, and these others instead keep on fighting by restoring the tabliczki, restoring the monuments that have been destroyed, and so on. For the last one, the language of memory, you asked a very provocative question, and I thank you, because it is actually a big problem. In a couple of weeks, Irina Fliege, which is one of the director of Memorial St. Petersburg, will receive a honorary degree in Italy, and we're currently talking about her speech, Lectio Magistralis, and she addresses this topic. And one of the key issues is that the language of the memory, which was not created by Memorial, was created by the victims themselves or by the heirs of the victims, the friends of the victims, has replicated the one of the perpetrators for many, many years, and has replicated a series of, Irina, for example, speaks about how in the interviews that she conducted with survivors or with sons or daughters of the survivors, there are typical sentences like, they took it, not understood, not clear who they are. He was there. He went to that place, not naming it. And a type of, this is incidentally is why I don't want to use liquidation, which is exactly the replica of the same problem. This has created a poor language of the victims. And it may be too late to recreate a new language, because we have now tons of material where this language has been replicated. Memorial has found itself, I think, forced to use it, because the very victims, the very survivors, the very people they were at the center of this process were using it, but there has been a long discussion that keeps on going on the language. So, but I think I will stop it there. Otherwise, I will take the time of Luba.
Thank you very much for the question. I think the pictures of inmates, we have two kinds of pictures made in the place during the imprisonment, and the pictures done after the liberation for by survivors. So it is a very important source, of course, for understanding how the landscape was perceived by the inmates themselves, because we, of course, they had their perception was, of course, different from our perception. But it is sometimes, especially when artists disappeared, which is sometimes very difficult to know what was the aim of these pictures, who was sometimes the picture could be commissioned by guardians or authorities of the camp, or by another inmate, but by another prisoner. It could be made for himself, because for it was a possibility to escape in the mind from the camp. And so we don't know exactly. We have many pictures where we don't see any presence of violence. For example, I'm thinking about Sergei Kovalyov, an artist who was imprisoned in Kolyma, and we don't know almost nothing about him, and his landscapes are very, very strange, because they are anxious, but we don't see dogs, we don't see fences, we don't see guardians, and just a sort of very deep gaze into the landscape. So and sometimes we can see some images almost fantastic. For example, the paintings of Sveshnikov, with the landscape of the camp is superimposed with some surrealistic scenes with allusion to Bosch or Bruegel and so on. Your second question was about my my approach. Yes. So I advocate immersion in the landscape as a method. I don't, sometimes it is not considered as very scientific, but it is very important. And I relay about, among other things, on visual media and particularly cinema. And now I'm making a documentary film, and with the camera, you sometimes you can see things that you don't see without. So I put, now I'm working, my research hours are now in Central Europe, as I cannot go to Russia, and including the Czech Republic, especially Jáchymov, this city, we heard about yesterday by Thomas Snigon. So there you can find a lot of remains, and I put the question, who is the author of the landscape? I'm thinking about it can be very strange, like this question, but I'm thinking about the Gombrowicz novel Cosmos, where the landscape is very premeditated and intentional. And of course, it is a paranoid vision of the world, but perhaps a researcher must adopt a paranoid approach because the search of meaning is always a little paranoid.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we have more questions. Margaret, then, yeah, okay. What? No, Kasia is coming. Kasia, first is Margaret here. First. I see her.
Thank you. Yes, thank you all for these papers. I really have a lot to think about, a lot about the directions and where we've come from. But I have a question for Anakin. I'm pro provocation at conferences, so I'm glad that you brought up so many incisive questions. But I have one specific question, which is, I'm familiar, obviously, with the works that really get angry with certain like memorial sites and museums for using kind of a Holocaust template to commemorate Soviet repressions. But at the same time, it seems to me that these, let's say, memory actors are really stuck, right? Because there's at the same time this idea of a cosmopolitan memory. And it's, of course, not just in Eastern and Central Europe, that the way you commemorate a genocide or an act of mass violence, also like in South Africa, also in Cambodia, here's your wall of names. Here is where you follow like the individual people's fates through the museum. Here is your space for reflection. And at the same time, there's this, we're familiar with the literature about EU accession and this real pressure to memorialize the Holocaust a certain way. So obviously these forms, these moral forms, these languages are known by the people who maybe do state museums and of kind of official memory characters. So it seems like these people who are in charge of these are really stuck in a paradox. There's this almost global like language of commemoration of a terrible atrocity. And then there are these voices that say, but no, it's, the Holocaust is different. And so you shouldn't memorialize it in this way, leaving aside these questions of collaboration and perpetration. So it's kind of a mess. So I'm wondering if you have any ideas of how it could move forward, right? Like any ideas of dialogues or maybe even examples of projects you've seen that, kind of do what quote unquote people expect of a global atrocity museum or site, and also kind of go out from a template that really doesn't quite fit the Soviet repressions, if you see what I mean.
Okay, thank you. We will collect Gavin that you don't, yeah, here. Yeah. And then Ihab and Sean.
Okay, I'm Gavin Slade, Nazarbayev University. So I think my question's mainly for Luba, I guess, but maybe Anakin and maybe Andrea. In fact, maybe all the panel could help me. Basically, we did some research in the last few years with focus groups, basically in different sites in Ukhtar, in Tomsk, in sites in Kazakhstan, so Zhezkazgan, Stepnogorsk, Akmola, Dolinka near Karaganda, which is all about basically consumption of prison museums in these sites and people's understandings of punishment on what we were thinking of as sort of a penal frontier. And basically, the results of that, in terms of what we find, the narratives that we see with our focus group participants is what we were thinking of as a trade-off narrative. So people say, well, yes, the Gulag was bad, but without the Gulag, we wouldn't have this town that I live in. And, all the things that are in this town. And we've been sort of struggling how to think of this. So I'm just curious about whether you could help me think about this in terms of ethics. I mean, you were sort of talking about Putinist ways of thinking, you know, Putinist memory. But from our perspective, you know, Occam's razor would basically say the reason people think this is just because of the sheer weight of their existential experience, their lived experience of growing up in a town which they know was built by prisoner labor. It's not so much, you know, a state-led narrative that led them to think this. It's just that's the reality they're presented with. And then they have the same feeling about landscape that Luba was quite beautifully talking about, which is this sort of conflicted, ambivalent sense of, on the one hand, this is very beautiful, the landscape. Some of the Gulag remnants that are in the landscape can be repurposed, reused for my own purposes today, you know, for picking mushrooms, for going out and about in the landscape, for fishing and so on. So I guess, I mean, Luba, maybe you could help me with this, but there might be other people on the panel maybe could comment on this. I mean, it links to Margaret's point about cosmopolitan memory, basically. I was trying to think of this as maybe agonistic, that framework of agonistic memory, where you allow people their interpretations without taking away their agency and assuming that this is, people are sort of being just affected by propaganda and this is the reason they think this. I mean, I guess the provocative question will be, are people wrong to think this? That's, yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. I don't know if you have time to answer the question, all of them, but just maybe to say something about what Enika said about this whole relationship of being caught in the past in terms of memory studies. I think it's very important also to think about from a present perspective. So I always actually kind of plead for memory studies in the present rather than the past. However, you can't escape the past. And I think maybe last few months, 2 months ago or something, we were in Berlin about what is to remember, what is left to remember from the Second World War. And I said, actually, what do people remember from the First World War? So I think actually it's important to see the moment in time where we are, especially in relation, for example, to generational distance, to the death of survivors, etc. And we have to understand that we're talking about a history of the Gulag that is more than 80 years now. So this is something seriously to consider in our kind of terminological, but also epistemology. What Barbara, somebody mentioned, the whole idea of the framework of knowledge that we can come up with. Second point maybe is to refer to this whole idea of the Stockholm Declaration. And I think that kind of declaration, it didn't really help East European countries so much in terms of memory politics, because actually they were mostly forced to recognize the Holocaust, although that we share the historical moment, let's say, however, with different connotations. So there's a whole competing memories framework at stake there, the signification. However, I understand that there's a much needed scholarship in the field of East European memory framework. However, I want to maybe ask Enika about this whole idea of comparison in relation to suffering. Because you mentioned Gaza, for example, but none of you actually mentioned the word genocide. Actually, this is also telling in terms of, we have to call things with their names. What is happening is that there is an Israeli genocide in Gaza. And actually, whether we like it or not, this is happening. So it's important to recognize this. And I think I see the danger, what you were referring to, Enika, because actually in few years, as a memory studies scholar, I think that soon we will be talking about a different kind of Holocaust. So it's important also to think about the whole idea of what you mentioned with Rothberg in relation to the comparison in relation to suffering and also to the hierarchies of suffering. Because how far can we go with comparison is also very important. If I hear, for example, Memorial is doing something on the victims of mafia, with all respect, and and the victims of the Gulag, how far can you stretch
the metaphor, you know? So I think it's really maybe a crucial concept to think about in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. And the last question from Sean.
Thank you very much for all your comments. I mean, this conference has been incredibly thought-provoking, and I hope I can articulate my question. It's a question about politics. You know, organizations like Memorial, Remembering Soviet Repressions, even Remembering the Holocaust, is about not allowing or preventing this in the future. But what we've seen, and particularly with the title we have here, Mobilizing and Weaponizing, historical memory is increasingly used for racism, genocide, and war. Have we hit some limits of this politically? Being caught in the tropes of the past, rethinking that, you know, this is another emergent Stalinism. We're looking at various political conditions today through the lens of World War II. How can we mobilize this kind of memory for a politics of democracy and human rights that it was intended to, and not how it's been captured by nationalism and racism and war and genocide?
Okay, thank you. And the last question, yeah, sorry, yes, because I felt like we have four guys and I excluded young Scott.
Yeah, okay. So I think the question is for Andrea, Anakin, and perhaps Barbara as well, but maybe all of you. So I'm just wondering about these, like, if you could expand more your thoughts on this new space of memory being created, so both physical and conceptual, from the bottom up abroad, so not within Russia, with all these transnational memories, but also transnationality of memory actors and the colonial memories, both within Russia and outside of Russia. So I hope the question is clear.
Yeah, thank you. We have 3 minutes left. So, so if you can give very consistent answers, and, you know, we have still time during the lunch to answer more broadly. Thank you.
Yes, I don't know. To Margaret, I cannot come up with examples of like new forms or dialogue. I in general think that templates are cultural tools to articulate things. So there is, in principle, there is no problem of borrowing cultural memorial forms or templates. I think the question is, what is the aim? And this is where they become problematic. My point was more about the seeing the use of the templates as problematic in itself. So not in always and in general. To Gavin, I think about the lived experience of those who see their town as being there thanks to Gulag. I think in a recent conference in Vilnius, Jan Kubik also drew our attention to the fact that we tend to juxtapose grassroots like experiences and views to the state institutions, but in the case of like far right populists, for example, grassroots is not always positive. So we also, I think, need to ethically consider these grassroots and lived experience kind of attitudes to things. So I think in that sense, the ethical reflection is important also in these terms. And to Ihab, yes, I totally agree that big changes in memory regimes are ahead of us, and it's difficult to orient oneself right now in what is going to happen in our field. But my sense is that we really need to think the consequences of genocide in Gaza and the Russian war in Ukraine together, because I see so not only in European societies but also in academia, they are often not, they are juxtaposed to each other, and really, as you know, in European societies, in Italy, people who support Palestine are completely indifferent to what happens to Ukrainians and so on. So I think as scholars of memory, we really need to think these two and others together, the current violence together to see where our field is supposed to go.
I will be short to answer to comment to Sean's question. I think it is precisely what we need today within European, not only European, global memory studies to understand this double-edged character of memory, and that it can be mobilized for reconciliation, understanding each other, but it can also be mobilized towards antagonism, aggression, and so on. And within Memory Studies Association, we have different advocacy groups, for example, working with memory issues. And I think there is not so much awareness of this complicated double-edged character. So we need more research on this, comparative research, I think. And to the last question about transnational memory, I think this is now when we see what after what happened after the Russian invasion on Ukraine, we have seen this really emerging transnational memory of colonialization, because previously it was mostly focused on overseas colonies and discussion about Western guilt towards overseas colonies, while now it's really very much discussion about internal colonies and about Russia, Soviet Empire as colonial power, which is difficult to accept. As in my meetings with people from global South, they have quite difficult to accept this idea that it could be also about colonialism in relation to Soviet Russia and so on. But now it's really spreading, and this is very much bottom-up perspective, I would say. So it's something to be followed.
I have it. Thank you. I will be short, and after we can discuss. Since 2018, I haven't been in Russia, so it is difficult for me to tell you how it would be today. But during my travels through Gulag spaces, I could see that for many of the persons interviewed, the word landscape have no sense, have no meaning. But people, and many times people refuse to talk about the difficult past and to talk about traces of violence in the landscape. But if when I tell them that I find their place of residence beautiful, it very, very often opens the dialogue. And the same people began to speak about the place, and sometimes they can say, no, it's awful, and start talking about the destruction of the landscape, and eventually bringing the past violence. So the very concept of beauty was, which was so problematic for me, I sometimes use it in order to access to someone considerations about it. Yeah, I understand it is not an answer to your question, but we can discuss it after.
Thank you. Yeah, and Andrea?
I'll try to be very fast and very brief. Well, first of all, just to specify, Memorial is not thinking about the victims of mafia. I was just putting there an example of how in this globalized context, going also to the last question, there is also an exchange of practices, an exchange with people that work in other environments to understand how memorialization is made, just as an example of how it's changing. But going to another side of your question, being caught in the past, well, first of all, the way that we can get out of the past is to see what practices are being implemented in the memorialization of the Soviet repressions in different places today, and compare them and try to have a focus on them. And second, generational distance, I don't think is the main problem here. As in, I see a lot of young activists, and actually there's a huge interest in the past and Soviet repressions, especially from young generations. And if you go back to the questions that me and Anna can view in different ways about when I meant the end of the war mourning phase, I meant that now the Gulag is the central theme of many literary works, independently of how this is treated. And most of these writers are young writers, or relatively young writers, that question themselves, question the past. I mean, we're all talking of authors in the 40s or 50s, most of them, not all of them. Going to the question of how to mobilize this knowledge for democracy. This is what Memorial has been trying for many years, but it's clear it failed. And Memorial itself is questioning itself on where have we failed. But it's difficult to understand, to give a definite answer to this. But I think my conclusion is that without the support of state, with the support of state in mobilizing society on a certain aspect, this is a very difficult feat, and it's very difficult that they can succeed. So in this current globalized context where there's also transnationality of memory activists, as it was said in the last question, it is important the role also of the states that are hosting these people. I mean, it's important that we don't just stop to the very fact of, oh, okay, they're here. But we also find ways to work with these people and to try to root their work and put it together so that issues like this can become a political issue on a wider space. And I think the space for Europe in particular, for the European Union in particular, right now is ripe. I mean, it's the right moment to do it because there's a big question also on the past repressions, based also on the use of past repressions made by Putin for waging this war. So I think that.
Thank you. Alexander, would you like to have the last word, please?
Well, not sure, but I want to respond to this question about trade-off the theory of the Gulag, that if we didn't have so we did have Gulag and all this kind of terror, but on the other hand, we say had a victory in the World War II. And the correct response, I think, would be yes, but exactly because we did not abolish the ЧК and KVD KGB, we have the current war. And all this suffering that is going on or will eventually come. The full collapse of the state, I think, because of that. That's basically the right response. And also, I think, is a response somehow kind of a potential response to your question, because this memory studies discipline is political through and through, and it always was. We just didn't understand it as clearly as we understand it now.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this wonderful panel and for these great questions. I'm sure we can continue during the break. So let's.
Thanks.